Hello, and welcome to the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. I'm Adam Hines, the CEO of the Institute, and I'm just thrilled to welcome you here to this virtual conversation, Election Architects, Designing Democracy in America. And we're hosting this with the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics, and my colleague Audrey Coleman will speak shortly. This event is part of our Bolstering Elections initiative that the two institutes have taken on together. Our bipartisan collaboration with the Dole Institute focuses on how vital resources are needed to support our local and state election administrators who are at the forefront of our democracy. And while they're underfunded, election administrators work tirelessly to administer secure and trusted elections in over 10,000 elections offices across the country. I'll just explain briefly that the Bolstering Elections initiative is an effort to assemble a team of policy experts and practitioners to examine why the study of funding of our election system is so difficult as compared to other government services, and to highlight models of success at the local level in particular. We launched that effort in February at the Dole Institute in beautiful Lawrence, Kansas, with experts from around the country and practitioners from throughout Kansas, including the Secretary of State, Scott Schwab. You can find recordings from those proceedings on our websites, and we'll have more announcements soon related to outcomes from this project. But today's conversation will highlight the multitude of design decisions made by elections administrators to deliver these critical government services, as demonstrated in an exhibit by our friends at Stanford University. So let me just say thank you to all those in attendance, including our members. Thank you for your support. It allows us to take on great events like today. And we look forward to your questions with folks after this discussion. So now I'd like to hand it over to Audrey Coleman, the director of the Dole Institute, where the exhibit is currently on display. Audrey, over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's such a pleasure to be with you today and see you, and to be online with our virtual audience with supporters from both the Bob Dole Institute here at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, and also friends of the Edward Kennedy Institute. This partnership has been so exciting. Our event that we hosted here in February to kick off the Bolstering Elections initiative was very illuminating, and we were so proud to engage the folks that Adam mentioned and elections administrators from across the country and all sorts of variety of jurisdictions, and hear more about the challenges that they face. So when our program lead, Tammy Patrick, mentioned that she had been a part of an exhibit project telling the story about what it takes. We talk about what it takes a lot here at the Bob Dole Institute, what it takes to run a free, fair, secure election, and what our administrators are doing every day, all year round, but particularly this time of year as we anticipate the presidential election this fall. We really can't, those of us who are the voters, can't really understand enough what they've done for us in order to protect our democracy and engage as many voters as possible. So this exhibit here at the Bob Dole Institute in our beautiful facility, I hope you'll come and visit it if you're here locally. And it tells a wonderful, all these details about the planning process, polling close locations, ballot instructions, poll worker training, cybersecurity threats, supply chain shortages, and all under a small amount of resources or changeable resources. We can't understand this well enough. And so pleased to welcome Tammy Patrick, who is a former commissioner on the Presidential Elections Administration Commission. We'll bring in her project partners, David Janka and Thomas Both of the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford University, the folks who created this wonderful exhibit, Election Administrators, Election Designers. I'll turn it over to Tammy. Tammy, thank you so much for moderating our discussion today.
Oh, thank you so much, both Audrey and Adam. I have to say this is a joy for me because it is merging two projects that I've been involved with in the last year or two that have been near and dear to my heart, and I'm just honored to be part of both of these efforts. I will say that when we think about who conducts our elections, most Americans don't think about who conducts their elections. They make a request to get a ballot mailed to them, they show up at the polls to vote, and they don't necessarily think about what happens behind the process, because election administration 20 years ago was a clerical role. it was a clerical role, and then it kind of converted to, by the way, you need to know a little bit more about technology now, because we have electronic poll books and we have other things that we're integrating into the function of administering elections. Now 2020 rolls around, or 2016, and we suddenly realize that we need to beef up our muscles around cybersecurity and foreign nation threats. And then, of course, 2020, we saw the global pandemic. And by the way, election official, you're also supposed to be a public health expert. Post 2020, we need to, as a profession, make sure that we are communicating effectively and with official information to the voting public to engender both confidence and trust. All of these things are improved with good design. All of these things hinge upon good design that interfaces with the person who is consuming it, who is moving through the process. And that's why this process with the D School at Stanford was so exciting for me. I don't have a background in design, which we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly that means. But being able to work with the two gentlemen you see on the screen, as well as others at the D School and students, it was wonderful to be able to collaborate with students. And I think we want to talk a little bit about that process. But I want to turn it over to both Thomas and David to share a little bit about what this process was and get us kicked off. So I'll turn it over to the two of you. I think in a few minutes, we're going to come back and see more of the exhibit. But for now, let's discuss a little bit about the thinking around design in this context of election administration. I think, Thomas, if you don't mind starting with that, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I could just start by introducing myself. I'm Thomas Both. I'm a designer. I'm a design educator. At the Stanford D School, I direct a program called Designing for Social Systems, which is about how can we use design to be more effective, more creative, more collaborative, more equitable in the work in the social sector. And I had the opportunity to join this project around design and elections in 2022 and had the chance to work with David. And I also want to call out Nadia Rahmani, who's one of our third major partner in this. And I've had the chance to jump into this project with the two of them.
All right. And hi, everyone. I'm David Janka. I'm a lecturer and designer in residence at the Stanford D School. And I'm the co-lead on our design and elections project with our colleague Nadia that Thomas just mentioned. I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of context about design and this space. So let me go ahead and share my screen. So we've mentioned the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design. We've also called it the D School. This is an entity at Stanford University where Thomas and I both work and teach. We grant master's degrees in design, undergraduate degrees in design, and also have a very robust elective program where students from all over campus come together to take classes and collaborate. So in this photo, you see Thomas here lecturing at the front of a classroom. You'll notice it's not a standard classroom. All of these students behind him are on a design team working on a project, and they're coming from different schools like business and education and engineering and learning some design techniques to apply to a real world project. So we really emphasize experiential learning and applying design tools to make an impact. So building off of that, one way to conceive of what we do is that we teach design in order to develop creative potential to make an impact in the world. This most often comes in the form of classes that we teach, but we also get to work on some projects to explore some emerging topics and spaces. We'll be talking a lot more about design and seeing more examples of what we mean by design. But for those of you that are maybe thinking of design very narrowly as purely aesthetic, we really want to expand your sense of what design can be. So it can be physical things like products, but it's also services, spaces, experiences, different processes and policies, and even at a very large level system. So really anything that humans are making is design. And there's an opportunity to think about how we're designing and what's the intent behind that design and what impacts are we making. In 2020, a group of us at the D School started working on this project related to elections. For all of you who I'm sure still remember, this was a very interesting time where we were coping with the pandemic. And in the summer of 2020, there were lots of questions about how are we going to pull off an election when there's all these new imperatives around social distancing and isolation. People who had been working in elections for a long time were unable to or felt uncomfortable or unsafe in those environments. And so a group of us got together to think about what could design do to help with this challenge. My background is in medicine and actually infectious diseases. So that's really why I joined this, kind of bringing in that perspective. And we ended up focusing on polling places and thinking about how we could help election officials, how we could support them in running an election in a place where people needed to actually physically come together. So as an example, we developed some resources thinking about how we could support election officials training poll workers and thinking about different public health safety considerations, making these open source for different election offices to adapt them. And so we really started to explore what it would mean to bring design into elections, but from this very narrow perspective of, pandemic amelioration. We learned a lot from that work. Some of these insights are here. So one thing that maybe some of you know, but we really want to make clear is that election administration is the essential infrastructure of democracy. Democracy requires that the people's voice and will is translated into those who will be leading. And so you need to have election infrastructure for that to happen. So this was a really interesting reframe for us. Another thing that we realized, we started to see is that, some of the things that election officials are doing require design, are design. And so we really put a stake in the ground and said, election officials are the designers of election administration, and they really design the experience of voters. So with some of those insights in mind, we began a new project in 2022, which is extended till the present, looking more broadly at the role of design in election administration. And so as we were doing this work, we were interviewing and having conversations with election experts all over the country, election officials and election workers from myriad states, coast to coast. And these were some of our big takeaways in terms of the role that design could play in elections. So we think it's an opportunity to increase the effectiveness of election administration. We think it's an opportunity to increase the public's trust in election processes and outcomes. We think design has a role to play in improving the experience of voters. And maybe equally as important, but often overlooked, is that design has a role in improving the experience of election officials. And all of these elements come together to build a more resilient and sustainable democracy, which I think the pandemic was a challenge to that. And we really think that design is something that can be added to the toolkit of all the amazing things that election officials already do. So in that work, we've done things like teach a class. Tammy's already mentioned we've worked with students on some different research projects, but what we're here to talk about today is this exhibit we developed called Election Administrators, Election Designers, that really focuses on the ways in which election officials are currently applying design and might be applying more design in the future. What you see right here is the Election Assistance Commission's election administrator competencies, the competency wheel. And so if you had a very narrow view of what election officials do, hopefully this starts to expand it. Look at all of the things that they are responsible for. Some of these responsibilities go throughout the entire year. Some are all about the preparation for election. A lot of these things come to bear on election night and even afterwards. And so they're dealing with people and technology and the media, military and overseas voting, in-person voting, vote by mail, just so many things that election administrators have to do. And in a lot of these competencies, we see overlaps with the design world. Now, I'd already mentioned at the beginning of my conversation that design manifests in different ways. So here's another way to look at that. I'm really thinking about where we were seeing design show up for election administrators. So of course, there's some graphics and communication design. Think about all the forms and paperwork and posters that are involved in running an election. There's also product design, the physical affordances, the voting booths, the tools that are used for voting. There's instructional design. You have to train poll workers. You have to inform voters of different procedures. There's also experience design, the experience of vote by mail, the experience of navigating a polling place. There's also process design. Think about all the different places that ballots have to go, chain of custody and security where those ballots are stored, and all of the things involved in producing an accurate and trusted vote. And then at a very large level, again, systems design, thinking about the way these different parts work together, these different entities and folks collaborate to pull off successful elections. So getting to our exhibit here, this is a summary of the 5 big themes, big areas that we saw design showing up in election administration, and really focusing on local election officials and how they were applying design in their work. So you see here, I'll just go down the list. Polling site selection and layout is the first category. Second, voter registration and communication. Third, election worker engagement, election worker being a broader term for poll workers. Fourth, ballot design and collection. And then finally, processing and reporting the vote. So again, these are the 5 big theme areas where we are seeing design show up. And this is how we've organized our exhibit, asking some key questions and showing a lot of examples for each of those. We're going to stop now. We're going to come back to the exhibit to get some more details. So I'm going to hand it back over to Tammy.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that we found both in election administration and design is that it's always important to pivot, because sometimes when things are well designed and I don't know, a moderator doesn't have her reading glasses on and skips way ahead on the agenda, everyone pivots and adjusts. So thank you both. The words I said a few minutes ago, I'm going to say again. So things that I really wanted to focus in on here, and I'll kick it to you, Thomas, and ask you the same question. Is when we're thinking about design in this context of elections and voting, what was either like your takeaway or something that surprised you, or how are you thinking about it in the grand scheme of election administration and voting, and what design can mean and does mean?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start just a little bit more on design, and just like if we take a simple view, might be let's start with like an object, like a well-designed object. Think about like a chair or like an espresso maker. Like there's probably what comes to mind when you think about well-designed objects. You might be thinking about like there's beauty in it. But when I think about beauty, I'm thinking about like there's intentionality in the details. So you can't think about that as aesthetics, but really we're thinking there's intentionality in the details that make this thing work. And then getting to that second point of the thing needs to work for people. It needs to serve people. And in the case of elections, it needs to serve the voter. And even more broadly, it ends up serving society and democracy. And so you might think about, design in elections also making them more durable, more resilient, more adaptable, and so on. And then at the D School, we're also particularly interested in not just really the objects or the outcomes, but how we work. And when I'm thinking about someone working as a designer or doing design work, I'm thinking about someone doing work that's, again, intentional. They're considering the details and how this is going to work. They're doing things that are human-centered. They're thinking about how this is going to serve somebody, how the needs of people and meeting those needs. And I'm also thinking about problem solving, like how do we figure this out? How do we make this work? And that in our world, we might call that prototyping and testing. But election officials and election workers are actually doing all these things. They're being intentional. They're being very human. They're serving people. They're problem solving. So we were excited about celebrating and highlighting all the hard work that election officials do, and also highlighting how they actually are acting as designers in the way that we think about design. And also that designers, you can think about the other side as like traditionally trained designers, also have a role to play to support elections administration. So that's how we were thinking about the connection between those two worlds. And they're kind of, I think those two worlds don't know each other very well. I certainly didn't know a lot about election administration before I started this, but there are a lot of intersections between that would be beneficial to both sides to understand each other more.
I love that explanation. And I think that part of what was really interesting with my interaction with this is that we don't think about good design because it's intuitive, you interact with it, you acknowledge it, maybe that it's beautiful, you get in your car and you turn something on, or you don't have to turn something on. You walk into your home and you say something out loud and something happens and you're not even thinking about it anymore, which that's the Jetsons, but okay. But when we think about how we interact with our voting systems, it's very, very different. And so I do think that it's sometimes we don't recognize good design, but we know bad design when we see it. And when bad design can affect someone's ability to participate in the franchise, that's when it's really, really, I think, comes to a head. And so, David, I wanted to turn to you because when we're working with election professionals in the beginning and even now when you interact with them, I would love to hear like your takeaway and some of your experiences with working with election officials and election professionals across the country.
Yeah. So, I think you're asking like, did they see themselves as designers or identify with that title? And I think in the broadest sense, no. In some ways, we were seeing that, and there were moments where we're like, well, even if you don't think you're a designer, you are. You don't have a choice. Like you're making these things, you're dealing with limited resources and constraints. You're translating policies and rules and regulations. You've got these firm deadlines. Like that's kind of the way that designers operate. And so even though they weren't necessarily identifying as designers, as we were bringing up certain use cases or certain examples, it was kind of becoming clear to them that they were creating, or as Thomas was saying, they're problem solving. And so whether or not they're calling it design, it is design. But what I will say is that we were also amazed as we were conducting these interviews of different election officials. We were amazed to see these examples that were almost like perfect for our students of like, this is a great example of something that we call, analogous inspiration, going out into the world and studying something that's in a different industry and bringing insights back to your own work. So we were seeing, for instance, an election official in North Carolina who would go to Black Friday sales to see like what happens when there's a flood of people and they're all trying to get to this cashier. And it's kind of like, there's lots of line management. What are they doing to solve that? And how could that inspire me to think about, rearranging my polling place? Another thing I will mention is that there are some incumbents in this space, some different organizations and players who have been working on bringing design into the elections world. So one that you'll see an example from momentarily is the Center for Civic Design. And so there have been some election officials who have been working with the Center for Civic Design and looking at, redesigning envelopes, redesigning forms for voter registration. And so some of those election officials have collaborated with designers, and that collaboration is really necessary for the future. But we hope that more election officials start to, think of design as part of their own toolkit. And even if they're not 100% a designer, they maybe think like, ooh, I need to flip into design mode, or I need to collaborate in a more designerly way.
Yeah, I would love now if we could maybe see some more of those examples and go back to the slide deck because I'm a very visual person. As much as I love chatting with both of you, I love to share the exhibit content that you all created. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Thomas, to share some more examples.
Yeah, great. I'll share a little bit more. It's actually a relatively big exhibit, so we're not going to be able to get to everything, but we want to give you a taste of the exhibit. So we're going to go a little bit into 3 of the areas that David mentioned here of these 5. And in the exhibit, we've articulated maybe a set of questions that actually are currently considered and need to continue to be considered in election administration where design plays a role. And actually, we would think about these as design questions or design challenges. Like we think they're well suited for design because usually when something involves humans, design has a role to play. And then we also in the exhibit show some examples of how election officials have responded to these questions. And there's also, of course, many more and more work to be done, but we want to highlight some of the work that's already done. So I'm going to start with polling site selection and layout. And as many of you know, I'm sure, polling sites need to be popped up every election cycle. They need to be identified and prepared. I think we're going to have about 100,000 in 2024, around that, in that range. And of course, many of those sites are repeated cycle to cycle, but some have to be identified newly each cycle. And some polling sites end up in government buildings. But many rely upon private buildings, private sector buildings. So I remember my parents growing up, when I was growing up, voting in a church. I voted in a private garage before. So election officials need to select the sites and prepare the sites and prepare them in a space that's not necessarily designed initially for a polling place. So actually on this slide, you can see some somewhat unusual sites: a laundromat, a train station, a one-story schoolroom, and actually also, as I said, a garage in San Francisco there. So putting on design lens, here are some of the questions we've asked ourselves, or we think that election officials are actually already asking themselves. Where should we place polling sites to maximize access? How can we effectively use the space to serve voters in those polling sites? How can we design polling sites for greater accessibility? And when voters come into their voting experience, how can we best guide them through that? I'll highlight a couple of things here. So I mentioned like needing to select sites and finding proper spaces to host polling sites. Beyond the specific buildings, there's also the question of where in the jurisdiction should we place those polling places so that they can serve the voters best. And there's many ways to do that. There is one tool we wanted to highlight, and that we have highlighted in the exhibit, is from USC. The Center for Inclusive Democracy has a voting location and outreach tool. So you can put in different variables for your jurisdiction, and then it will create a model of where you might place your voting sites to be most effective in serving voters. And then you can also think about, once you have those sites, how are you designing the interior? How are you designing the flow and layout of those sites? So here's a site in an arena in 2020 in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm sure a lot of that layout and flow is done on the ground, and even what we would call prototyping, trying to like, how are voters going to move through this? In more complicated cases, there's also a tool that University of Rhode Island has created called the URI, or Votes Polling Location Diagrams tool, where you could actually diagram and model out how you'd lay out a site and how voters might move through that, so that you get more efficient flow, a better voter experience, and so on. So I'll highlight a little bit, secondly, about voter worker engagement, or say election worker engagement. So if we're thinking about election workers, and particularly about temporary poll workers or election workers, again, every voting cycle, you need to recruit and train those folks to help run elections. So especially for those folks, like, here's some of the questions we might be asking. How can we attract and recruit election workers? How can we design trainings for all election workers to be more engaging and effective? And then how can we appreciate and celebrate election workers for all the work they do? And that's, of course, also related to, one is just like appreciation itself and celebration of that, and also retaining election workers. We want them to come back and keep working in the next election. So when we think about instructional design, that's something we think a lot about at the D School. How can we think about a live training, like people in a room learning how to, run a polling site, or how to deal with security risks. Think about how those can be engaging, how can those be practical. In a lot of cases, those would benefit from being hands-on. So that's actually design work. How do you design your training is design work, of course. And we can think about materials themselves. Here's a nice example from the city and county of San Francisco, where you see a clear manual for poll workers, logical, visual, using color to distinguish different elements, steps broken down, and so on. So again, this is of course, some graphic design and instructional design that's being used to train election workers. Last area I'll just touch on is ballot design and collection. And in some ways, actually, this is a kind of an ultimate graphic design challenge. I mean, you need it needs to work for everybody. It needs to be clear to the voter. It, in most cases, needs to be able to be counted by a machine afterwards, some cases also by a human, and actually checked usually both ways. And there's usually a lot of races, a lot of candidates, potentially a lot of initiatives to list. So, and the whole thing needs to be accurate. So in a lot of ways, this is like, maybe this should be given to like every design student as a challenge, how to like design a ballot in some ways. And you can also think about it as like a user interface. Like we are using this interface, whether it's a paper ballot or an electronic ballot, electronic device, as an interface to cast our votes and collectively to do the fundamental act of democracy of voting. So like actually there's a lot that needs to be right about a ballot to serve voters. And you can think about even wider than the ballot itself, of course. Some of the questions that we ask, and we know that election officials ask themselves, are how can we help voters navigate the ballot, so use the ballot successfully? How can we design ballots that are accessible to many types of voters? How can voters successfully return their ballots? And then related to that, how can we design secure and efficient drop boxes for ballots? And then how can we design our vote by mail systems to serve voters and also allow for efficient processing? So there's actually a lot of work to do to both produce those ballots and to collect and count those ballots. We mentioned before, David had mentioned the Center for Civic Design. They have a number of guides, resources, templates, and so on, including this one that gives guidelines and instructions for how to write great instructions for voters, and particularly on ballots. So that's a great guide. And then we can back up from a typical paper ballot and also think about ballots that serve people with different abilities, people that read and speak different languages. And here's a tweet from Maricopa County, Arizona, highlighting how people have used their Braille ballots and also large print ballots as well. So that gives you some view, I hope, of how we both ask questions and start to answer them in this exhibit. And with that, we'd like to continue on the conversation and talk more about it.
It makes my heart so happy to see the Braille and large print ballots. That was my job for over a decade in Maricopa County, was actually creating those and sending them out to dozens and dozens of voters who needed them in that alternative format in order to vote independently. So there are a couple of things I wanted to touch on before we jump into some of the bigger discussion, and that is, there's an adage in elections that people like to say all the time, and that is one size does not fit all. And acknowledging that the viewers to this session are going to be all across the country, they might recognize some of what we're talking about as something that applies to them in their jurisdiction. But there are differing rules of engagement all across the country when it comes to who can be a poll worker, where can you have a polling location, what are the dates and deadlines, and how you communicate to voters. It gets really complex, and so complex that we have tools like the Center for Inclusive Democracy that you mentioned that actually takes into account, I think it's 15 different layers of data in order to help election officials make these decisions. But the thing that I'm always see, it's universal. There are many things, voters register or get on a list, they vote, we create ballots, is color coding and checklists. Color coding of materials. I was just in Ada County doing a tour of their office in Idaho last week, and it was checklist, color coding. Those are, of course, design elements. And so when we think about, when you were trying to narrow down, or when we were trying to narrow down which areas to focus in on around election administration, if you could just share kind of the process about why these 5 areas were chosen and what was so interesting about these particular areas of election administration and of election official acts.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So the development of this exhibit, of course, in and of itself was a design process. So we went through a lot of different iterations. One element of this design process that you're speaking to is that sometimes when you're designing, you are flaring or you're going wide and collecting a lot of possibilities. And other times you are focusing and you're narrowing and you're making some decisions about what content to include. So we started by flaring, by really looking everywhere that design was manifesting any any product or service or experience related to elections and kind of put it all up on a wall. And then we started to kind of filter and organize and look for some different themes, look for which examples were maybe the most compelling. But something that was really important in the filtering process is we were considering election officials and election administrators as one of our primary audiences. So we really wanted to look at what were the elements of election administration that election officials have some or all control over, so they could actually learn from this content. It might influence the way that they are doing their work. So in the United States, Thomas has already mentioned, or we've already heard, like thousands of different polling places and 10,000 jurisdictions. You had just mentioned, Tammy, they all work a little bit differently, but there's still some elements that cut across different jurisdictions. And so in one jurisdiction, it might be more of a collaboration between state officials and local officials, and another place it might be all local officials. But we were looking for the place where they would have the most opportunity there. Thomas has also mentioned the term human-centered design. So we were also thinking about where are the places where people are showing up, where people are interacting with other people, or people are interacting with objects. And we thought that those would be really good to focus on. And then we organized a little bit to try to simplify some of the overwhelm. I think in working in this space, we spent a lot of time trying to understand this complex system and all of these different pieces. And so boiling things down to, like the number 3 or the number 5 is sometimes a really good way to allow people to even start to wrap their head around it. So that's where we kind of brought in these five theme areas. We played around with some different things, thinking about the chronology of elections, thinking about orienting it in the voter experience or in the election official experience. And so again, we iterated and ultimately thought that this would be the best way for people to jump in and maybe learn more about something they already knew about, or maybe find an area that was new to them and start to conceive of it in a designerly way.
I love that you bring in the notion of the audience, because we did have quite a bit of conversation around that. And Thomas, I don't know if I see you smiling, so I'm wondering if you want to mention, when we talked about this exhibit, and that's why I'm so thrilled that it is currently on exhibit at the Robert Dole Institute, which is beautiful. And I highly recommend going. It has the most beautiful stained glass window I think I've ever seen in my life. But that's why I'm so excited that it's there, because when we were thinking about the audience, we were thinking about, how do we embolden, empower, or celebrate election officials being designers and doing design, but also have an exhibit that can be shared with the public around the design of their election system? And so I don't know if you want to say something to that, about that particular topic, Thomas.
Yeah, well,
Or
it's a challenge because there are pretty different audiences. I mean, we were trying to both, as you said, we want election administrators and election officials to see themselves in this exhibit, and also consider oh yeah, I am a creative person. I am a designer in the way that we're thinking about design. I do this work, and it's important work, and I am intentional about that work. And I could maybe keep using some tools of design and keep learning about how design could help me. But also we have this the general public doesn't know that much about election administration. They mostly know about their own voting experiences, right? What they see on maybe the front end. So we also are trying to explain some of the basics, or some of the many aspects of election administration to that audience. And again, as David was talking about, how do we highlight the things where design could have the most impact? And those are the areas that we tried to bring out in the exhibit. I did also want to point out, your initial example about color coding. That's a good example where the voter is never going to see that, but that we would consider that design, right? That's actually process design that's behind the scenes, where perhaps you're trying to sort ballots in different batches to be processed. Humans are naturally going to create systems that help them do what they're trying to do better. That's design. So I think it's worth mentioning that as well. Sometimes we think about design as okay, I made something, I made a ballot, and someone's going to use it. But design could also be processes that you and your staff use internally.
I'm going to say,
add
to that.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yes.
I'm just going to share my screen again. So
Excellent.
I'm thinking about audiences. So here we are in August of 2023. We're in Orlando at the Election Center conference. And so here our primary audience is election officials. So you see that they are observing these posters. We even saw some of the pictures and was like, wait, that's my polling site. Like that's what I designed. And so we saw both some resonance and also some curiosity and some reframing and some questioning there. So that was a really interesting opportunity to see how that audience was receiving it. But another audience that was really important to us, and it continues to be important, is both current designers, but also future designers. And so this is the exhibit popping up at the Stanford D School in our atrium. And this was during Democracy Day, so in November of 2023, where classes are canceled and there's events all over campus to engage the community in democracy. And so these students are learning about some different aspects of design. For those of folks that are looking at the image, that's actually Tammy talking through one of the particular elements of ballot processing and kind of designing for transparency. So when people are observing different elements of ballot counting, how can an office think about setting that up so that way they are seeing what they need to see, but also that there's space for that accurate counting to occur. And so we're hoping that some of our design students are inspired to maybe work in this election space, or maybe even in the public sector more broadly, or even just think more intentionally when they are voting about opportunities for improvement or all of the work that election officials put into designing that experience.
Mute. Yeah, that threw me today. And I will say that it was one of the things that we were very intentional about, was having people see themselves in the exhibit, and also demonstrating that election officials are your neighbors. They're, the people from next door. They are the people who are, shop at your grocery store, what have you. And so one of the things that one of the reasons why I was so excited for this event had to do with this project that we're working on. This bipartisan effort is all about bolstering elections and thinking through how do we support our election officials. And I think that quite often the general public doesn't realize that elections are historically and traditionally underfunded, and oftentimes necessity is the mother of invention. I have example after example of how election officials have leveraged the most ordinary objects. In fact, I've said if I ever retire, I'm going to do a coffee table book about the use of PVC pipe in elections. And I'm sure people are like, what are you talking about? My favorite was a county that used 2 Christmas tree stands because they were on wheels, created an archway with PVC pipe, and then zip tied 2 tablets on the top and put RFID chips on all of their voting equipment. So at the end of the election, when the equipment came in, they could just roll it under this crazy MacGyvered archway of PVC pipe and Christmas tree stands to get their inventory in without having to scan things individually. And there's all sorts of examples. I was just in a jurisdiction in the last month, and they use pool noodles for certain things. So talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about how is it that sometimes you may have noticed that election officials were pushed to be designers, and that can be innovative and exciting, but are there things that we can do to support them so that they don't have to duct tape and use chewing gum and paper clips sometimes to keep going?
Well, maybe I'll start out by just reiterating some of the points you made, that we saw all these examples of being scrappy and resourceful. And a lot of times it wasn't necessarily, it didn't feel like it was under stress. It was more just like, voting is this community act. And in your community, like, your uncle has a wood shop and he can help you like make a table, and your aunt has the ability to sew, and so she can make some of these. So it's just like all of these different ways that people can chip in their skills, even down to like bringing food for poll workers or throwing a celebration afterwards. So I do think there's something beautiful about this diversity of experiences of voting in America, where you really are able to leverage those different skills and resources in communities to get that work done. Some of the first examples I think of, kind of answering your question, Tammy, is in the work we did with COVID adaptations. We were hearing about all of the ways that people were adapting polling places or trying to make things safe for people to touch, and there's systems for, pens and cleaning those pens. And I remember there was a jurisdiction in Wisconsin that had this like Ziploc baggie system. And so one of the things that we had developed in that work was like a lookbook to just show people like, here's a few dozen examples of what people are doing for these different elements of adapting their polling places. I do think that what you say about adequate funding is really important, is that in order to do this work, you need to have resources. And even though constraints are useful in design, there are some basic necessities that need to be met. And we have to continue to evolve the election experience, because technology is going to change, the needs, the policies, the rules are going to be evolving. And so it's kind of an ongoing process to navigate.
Yeah, I would also add that hopefully this exhibit plays some role in helping the public understand what a process, what the level of work that is needed to run elections actually is. I certainly didn't know myself. We mentioned this a few times. All those competencies that are required, that are added to as the world changes. In some ways, this exhibit is a celebration and acknowledgement of like all those different areas.
That's great. So we're going to move to our Q&A, and if anyone has a question, please use the raise your hand function, and our moderator will help organize those. While we're waiting for those questions, I think we've kind of put the bow on here, but are there any particular epiphanies that you saw throughout this process where, what are your biggest takeaways here that you would convey, but just for the work moving forward, because this effort is still ongoing?
I'll start and just say, kind of building off of our insight that election officials are designers. Part of that is election officials are these natural collaborators, and they share their work. And so there's just this big epiphany of like, oh my gosh, there's these kind of like informal networks of ways that people are exchanging ideas and saying like, well, here's a template that I used, or here's something that worked. And so that to me was just really inspiring, and something that I think we also are wondering, how can we support that and amplify that? Because I think there's so much opportunity in the people who are doing the work, sharing their ideas and letting those inspire their fellow election officials. Thomas?
Yeah, Tammy, early on in this webinar, you'd mentioned good design and bad design. And actually, it's kind of amazing that any registered voter, any eligible voter can go into a polling site or get their ballot in the mail and cast a vote, and it gets counted and it works. In the overwhelming cases, it works really well, actually. So that's actually kind of amazing. We should expect that, but we should also celebrate that there's 10,000 different jurisdictions running elections and how well the system works. I think we should acknowledge, celebrate, and lift that up. That's one thing that, again, like, we should expect it, but we should also fund it, as to your point, and see how continue to support it. Like I've read that, like, there's less private buildings, for example, that are private owners that are willing to share their buildings for voting, because now it's a little bit more contentious. We need, as a society, to not just put it all on election administrators and be part of this process as well as the public, as a community.
I think that's such an important point to remember, is that it really does take an entire community. You have, we know that 8% of our election officials serve 75% of the nation's voters, and 75% of our election offices serve 8% of the nation's voters. So we have this wide variety of sizes of office, of our offices and the work that they do, and a wide variety of resources that are available to them. And it not only takes those individuals, but it takes hundreds thousands of poll workers and hundreds of thousands of temporary workers to work in the warehouse, to drive the trucks, to deliver polling place materials. It takes the law enforcement community. It takes people who own businesses to put up their facilities, to have places of worship, who open up their doors for training classes and polling locations. So it really does take everyone, including legislators. And so one of the things I often think is, if I had a magic wand that I could wave, there would be some laws changed that change the way that our materials are required to be sent out, or require the language that's required to be on it, or the language that's required on a ballot, because oftentimes it's bad design. Right. So you mentioned Center for Civic Design, and when people get their ballots, and hopefully everyone on the call is going to vote in their upcoming elections, take a look at how it's designed. Look at the headings. Look at, are they center justified? Are they justified on the side? Are they bold? Are they all capitals? Does that make it harder to read? The answer is it does. So there are things that are statutorily required in law that are bad design. And so if you were going to wave your magic wand, what change would you want to see that you saw as bad design that might potentially be solved with better design? And then I think we have one question after that magic.
David, do you have a magic wand wish? I mean, I think about that for a second.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thought that came to mind, I don't know if it's like one specific change, but maybe it's like one specific type of support, or kind of inviting this into the process. And it maybe sounds like a little bit dry, but robust user testing, actually more exciting than it sounds. But there are so many opportunities to actually put prototypes and ideas and things that are being developed in front of the voters, and involve them in that process and get their feedback. You know, that is so essential to design, is that you are designing with the people that you are, you know, creating things that they're hopefully going to be using. So I don't know exactly what that looks like from a legislative standpoint, but actual maybe like support, or an imperative, or I don't know, like a requirement that there is some type of like testing and interaction. There are some jurisdictions now that are doing that and practicing that and learning that, but I think there's a lot of jurisdictions that are like so constrained in terms of time and resources that just feels like a luxury. So I wish that involving the citizens and the voters in the development of these things felt more like a natural, normal thing, rather than something that only a few offices get to participate in. So that's kind of my wand.
Yeah, I mean,
Magic wand, or you want to pass? We can go ahead and go to the questions as well, if Kyle wants to cue the Q&A.
Thank you. Our first question comes from Emily Rapp. Emily, you've been given speaking permissions. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, Tammy. Hi, Thomas. Hi, David. A great presentation. I have a question for you, kind of going off of Tammy's PVC example, which is always a fun one. Are there any other resourceful design decisions that you've found or explored that you think would be scalable or replicable, particularly for smaller elections administrators? Just thinking about, they aren't always properly resourced, but there's certain things that work for certain offices, but not for others. But are there any design decisions you can reflect on that are scalable and replicable?
Let me think here. I'm like scanning through.
You might have the best insight into that. Do you have thoughts, Tammy?
Oh, I was waiting to see if you all had any. So I think that there are a number of really important ones. And the first one that comes to mind, because we know that we have tens of millions of voters who choose to vote by mail, either absentee, vote by mail, no excuse absentee, whatever it's called in your state. And that is a good design of the envelopes. And that's a relatively easy lift, because Center for Civic Design has created templates that we vetted with the Postal Service to make sure that they are what they call automation compatible. So it goes through the postal stream easily. And so I think there are templates and there are materials that are available, through both government agencies as well as nonprofits that offer them at no charge, and that election officials can leverage. And thankfully, that's something that's been a really big uptick in the past few years. So do you all have any other examples that you wanted to share before we
Maybe I'll just touch
Yes,
briefly,
David.
and there are like a couple involving technology, which certainly is not the answer to everything, but if in terms of like scale, that's kind of where my mind went. I think we're seeing the development of some really interesting ways to, manage poll workers, even just using things like, spreadsheets or an application like Airtable, where really you can empower election officials to have the information that they need to push messaging and information to those poll workers to keep them informed and plugged in, and maybe even navigate things like natural disasters or other last minute changes. Another thing that I've seen that's interesting on some jurisdiction websites are tools to visualize, where the polling sites are, or where the drop boxes are, like what's the waiting time, and some of those kind of like live indicators that can really, again, reach a lot of people really quickly. So just a couple tech things, but I like the envelope one as something that is a little bit low tech, and maybe something that people might not realize can really impact the way vote by mail happens.
One thing that strikes me is how much knowledge and wisdom there are in just the people that work in election administration, and how is that transferred to the next generation of people. Particularly, like poll workers, we know like there's been a shift traditionally, there's been a lot of older people that have done that. And there's examples of jurisdictions intentionally targeting other demographics as well. So like high school students, for example. But I'm curious about, in terms of efficiency and replicating success, like how do those older, more experienced poll workers, election workers pass on their knowledge? Maybe there's ways to do that.
That's great. The one last thing I want to say before I turn it back over, first of all, thank you all for joining us, and thank the two of you for your work on this. It has truly been an epiphany for me day after day. Whenever we talk, I learn a million new things. One of the biggest takeaways I've had from working with you all, not only how design touches so much of our life, but the design of meetings, of conversations. And one of the frameworks that I mentioned this a week ago to some election officials, and they came up and they said, that is amazing. I'm taking this back to my office. And that is, I like, I wish, and I wonder. So when you're having a conversation about implementing a new process or looking at a new design of a form, to be able to talk amongst each other, amongst the staff and your team and others, to say something that you like about what you're looking at, what's being reviewed, something you wish it could be, and then wondering other things that might be possible. So with that, thank you all for being with us, and I want to turn it over to Adam for closing.
Thanks so much to all of you, Tammy, David, Thomas, for this conversation, and congratulations on this exhibit and the work that you've done. This truly has been a celebration of the selfless, behind-the-scenes work of thousands of workers across the country who truly are the backbone of our democracy. So I really appreciate you shedding the light on that work and the challenges that are basically happening when we don't even know it throughout the year, but especially during an election year like this. One reason I found this work so important is I keep seeing more and more research highlighting the importance of the experience of people when they engage with government, not only elections and voting, but any form of engagement with government services, and how that influences and impacts their participation in democracy, and even if they choose to participate. And so nothing could be more central to that than their experience at the voting booth. So I just want to underscore this. Essential infrastructure of democracy was a phrase that I wrote down during this conversation. I appreciate this. So let me just say my final word of appreciation and thank you to everyone who's at home and enjoyed this conversation, to our Kennedy Institute members and staff alumni community who joined the live audience. Thank you for those watching the recording on YouTube. And we invite all of you to come to our website and those of the Dole Institute and join our programs or become a member. And with that, Audrey, I'll hand it over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Adam. Tammy, thank you for moderating that wonderful discussion with our panelists, David and Thomas. It was an outstanding discussion. It really highlights one of the many reasons I'm proud to host this exhibit here at the Institute is because we're a nonpartisan institution. We encourage folks to engage with each other and connect over issues with which they may not have similar political perspectives. This is an opportunity for all of us to come together, and in the spirit of Senator Dole and Senator Kennedy, this is a wonderful way to continue on their legacy. We can be resources. We are resources. Our institutions both are for the general public, for sharing clear and high quality information about these electoral processes. I mean, where do you go in this world of information? Trusted institutions like ours, like those of Kennedy and Dole and many other civic institutions have a lot to offer, and we have a tremendous role in these days where the information landscape is vast and very confusing, even for adults, and you can imagine how it is for younger generations. So we had the awesome opportunity to show the exhibit last week to some students at our Youth Civic Leadership Institute who came through. All of our museum gallery visitors come through and are really, it's pulling back the curtain on all of these details, not just the service and the challenges that these elections administrators do, but this opportunity, as Adam said, to show care, for people to show care for one another and to build trust in each other and in our processes of democracy. So for those of you who are here locally, I hope you will come to the Dole Institute if you haven't yet to come see this exhibit. You've seen a preview through the presentation this afternoon. For those of you who can't visit the Dole Institute, our website, doleinstitute.org, we have wonderful programs online. Our programming season being revolving here around the University of Kansas really gears up in the fall with the academic year. I want to thank Tammy, David, Thomas, Nadia, who couldn't be with us. Adam, thanks so much for this opportunity. It's been really wonderful being with all of you this afternoon. Thank you for all of your work, for moving this conversation forward and building us for a shared future. So I look forward to engaging with each of you in any number of ways in the future, and hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.